So this is the tomb of Jamali-Kamali in the sort of Mehrauli archaeological park. And the saint who is buried here, this is a dargah, so it obviously commemorates a Sufi saint who is buried there, and outside whose burial place, Qawwalis take place to create a sama of followers, and this is very much has been in practice in India for hundreds of years. So the saint who is buried here is called Jamali, and the grave next to Jamali's grave inside this tomb belongs to someone called Kamali. Now when you ask anyone who was Kamali, what was his relationship to Jamali, you're going to get a plethora of answers, right? You're going to get multiple people saying multiple things. Someone will say, oh, he was his brother, right? Some people will say he was his disciple. Some people will say he was a neighbor. Some people will say he was his best friend. Some people, one person has actually said to me he was his wife, right? And so there is a way in which the name of the relationship between Jamali and Kamali is fairly unknown. What we do know about the two of them is that they seem to have been closely associated in their lifetimes and are buried next to each other after their death. Now, Jamali-Kamali's tomb is in sort of colloquial terms called the gay Taj Mahal, and it is absolutely stunning on the inside. But what I find interesting about this idea of calling it the gay Taj Mahal, of course, is it answers the question of who were Jamali and Kamali by saying that they were two lovers, which they could well have been. But I'm more interested in the fact that there could be potentially multiple relationships between them that we don't necessarily name. What I find interesting about this dargah, and it's actually difficult to get inside it because, of course, the Archaeological Survey of India and all its wisdom has it under lock and key. So you've got to make a special application and go specially to see that, and which is virtually an impossibility. So those are just archival photos. But what's interesting about it is on the outside, this image on your left, that's the tomb from the outside. And what's interesting about that tomb is that it has a flat roof. Whereas as you can see from the roof on the inside, it's a dome. And this is one of those fascinating architectural features in which the outside of the building is different from the inside of the building. And the flat top, if you look at Sufi graves, Muslim graves actually, the flat gravestone belongs to women with nothing else on top. It's the flat gravestone. So in many ways then, the building ceiling on the outside is feminine, if we want to think about that in architectural terms. Inside, the two gravestones that belong to Jamali and Kamali, we know they belong to men because male gravestones have a little pen box on top of the flat gravestone to indicate the saint who wrote poetry or who sort of, created words of wisdom and works of wisdom. And that sort of soars up above the flat top, which is exactly what happens on the ceiling in the inside of the tomb. So there's something extremely androgynous about this tomb because sort of female on the outside and male on the inside. And of course, if we were to say that to anybody today, we would say, oh my God, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm bisexual? Does that mean I need to be transgender or transsexual? And all these, rather than becoming angst-ridden questions for either the builders of the site or the people buried there or the people who continue to worship there, becomes one among a multiplicity of possibilities that they celebrate whenever they go there. And so Jamali and Kamali, possibly lovers, possibly disciple and teacher, buried together after the disciple died. The teacher had already been buried there, which, by the way, is another taboo today, right? How can you have a relationship between a teacher and a student? And so there is a way in which this dargah, and this is not unique by any means, right? Nizamuddin and Khusro buried together, Bulle Shah and Shah Inayat not together but close together, Madholal Hussain, who is Madholal and Shah Hussain, buried together in Lahore, or just north of Lahore. In fact, Hussain fell so madly in love with Madholal that he changed his name to Madholal Hussain. Right? So there is a way in which all these dargahs give us a version of desire that is between two men, but that is not named any particular category by which we can identify it in one particular way alone. And so this to me is fascinating because again, it militates against almost everything that we're encouraged to believe today or talk about today or think about today. And so dargah desire then becomes a very sort of very eloquent example of what it means to allow desire to exist in a form that you don't necessarily pigeonhole it into. Can we think about desire between two men, expressed in terms of soaring poetry, expressed in terms of marvelous architecture, without necessarily having to call it by one name or another?
Subscribe to Sarmaya and be a part of the stories and conversations around art, history, and culture.